maybe. Great to see you all. So I hope you're enjoying the Transforming Transport session number 22. My name is Charles Cormier. I'm the Regional Director for Infrastructure in Europe and Central Asia here at the World Bank. So covering, of course, transport, but energy and urban development. I thought, first of all, we have great panelists. I'll introduce them in a minute. And the idea is a bit to have an interactive session. So let each of them respond to a first question. We'll have a second series of questions, and then I will, of course, try to get some questions from you. So we're happy to hear your questions. The theme of the session, of course, is resilient logistics and supply chains in transforming transportation. In Europe and Central Asia, since I arrived in this job about 4 years ago, the topic has really been hot, I would just say. In particular, of course, the countries of Central Asia have been quite interested in the Trans-Caspian corridor, the Middle Corridor, and in working with their neighbors, China, but also the South Caucasus and all the way to Europe. And I think the reason we see that is a threefold reasons. I think one is that there was huge supply chain disruptions during COVID. The port of Shanghai had issues around workers and essentially huge congestions, and we saw more traffic coming through the Trans-Caspian corridor. The other major shock that we saw, of course, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which meant that some freight wanted to find alternate routes for them, self-selecting, not having to go through the northern route. So this also became important for the corridor. But the other real reason, so yes, the corridor became important for shocks. But I have to say there's also interest in this region to increase its trade. Central Asia is a region that has only 1% of the global trade. So trying to diversify their economies and connect with their neighbors. So there's a real economic imperative. Our assessment is that you could triple the volumes in half the time if you invested in the right investments and did the right policies to address the bottleneck. So huge interest in this region on that. Globally, we're seeing, of course, lots of issues around other trade corridors. Just to give you a couple of examples, the Red Sea, as we know, is a conduit for 30% of the world's container traffic. And due to the conflict in the Middle East, we saw a drop of 50% of that traffic over a few months. People using the port, a different route through the Port of Good Hope, and adding several days to the freight traffic. There's a severe drought that happened in Central America, so the Panama Canal saw also a significant drop. So there's issues around both efficiency of logistics, but also resilience. So this is the panel that's going to address these issues. We at the World Bank have been working on this topic for quite a while. We've invested about $30 billion over the last decade in this topic of trade corridors. WRI is a great partner of knowledge, and there's a lot of great panelists here, so I'm looking forward to the conversation about the role of infrastructure, the role of financing mechanisms, the role of technology, the role of IFIs, but also what is the impact on some of the trade, in particular, perhaps food security. So with that, let me start by introducing the first speaker. Sorry, let me change the table. I wanted to first introduce François Daven, who's the managing director of the International Union of Railways in Paris, who will bring insights on the role of infrastructure. So, and I'll introduce the other speakers while I'm asking them a question. So, maybe François, the question to you is the critical role of specifically of railways. So in this region, since I arrived, I see a lot of interest in investing in railways, and so what is your view of how railway infrastructure be better integrated into multimodal logistics systems, in particular in lower middle income countries? So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for this question. Well, I do think that railways has been one of the first modes that have been delivering freight on land transport, and progressively the modal share of railway has been decreasing. So it's not something that is equal among regions. For instance, here in the US, I think the modal share of rail is above 35, 40%, so it's quite huge. In Europe, in comparison, it's about 17%, so it's quite low. But nevertheless, the main advantage of railway from an economic perspective is that it's extremely resilient to disruption. And I think we saw that during COVID-19 because it was evoked. All our operators that were dealing with freight, I've seen their activity increasing because the truck industry is a huge problem to find drivers. And well, with the train, obviously, well, in Europe, it's 40 trucks. Here in the US, it's probably more 800. But you have one driver or two drivers, and you are able to move a lot of goods on land transport. It's also quite resilient because it's a centralized infrastructure. So in case of disruption, you have a lot of indicators and you have a lot of people that can intervene and also reroute the traffic. And I do think that we saw that in a way during the Ukrainian crisis. We saw that first within Ukraine, because in UIC, well, Ukraine is a member of UIC, obviously. We had a task force during the war. And we saw that, in fact, the rail network was really the backbone of what remains of the possible mobility for Ukraine, both for people. At the time, it was more than 200,000 people that were out of Ukraine for the rail sector each day, and also for the essential furniture. And also what we have been able to see is that for the corridors, well, there have been some rerouting from the north corridor to the south corridors. I mean, there is possibility to adapt. On the other hand, if we are looking perhaps to the weakness of the sector in terms of future development, it's a sector that it's still not really with a single governance and with a very large degree of interoperability. We are still lacking interoperability. We are still lacking common rules in a way that could be taken as a failure of UIC, because since 1922, we are trying to give common rules, common method to the whole sector. But still, due to the fact that the investment is huge when you are doing a railway line, every company is trying to make national optimization. And I do think that one of the subjects we have ahead of us is really to convince our members, because UIC is member base. We have all the great operators on the planet, SNCF, DB, China's Railway, Indian Railways, to convince them that they need to work together to have more common methods and to be sure to lower the cost of the investment. Things that basically the maritime sector or the aviation sector did years ago with great success of ICAO or IMO. And I do think that what we have in perspective. So in a nutshell, that will be my response to the question. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Francois. So a very resilient mode, and adaptive, a road that's able to adapt, to be agile, but with some issues around operational issues. So let's move to Sarah. So let me introduce Sarah Mourinho, who's the Senior Director for Sustainability at DP World. She has expertise in sustainable and resilient ports operations. So let's move to the issue of ports. So ports also, of course, serve as one of the major nodes in a multimodal system, the key node, and they face huge challenges. We talked earlier about the congestion issues. There are climate issues, and of course, geopolitical disruptions. So what could be the strategy to enhance the resilience of ports infrastructure and operations?
Thank you. I will start briefly by explaining what and who DP World is, because I think we frequently get a question of what company is that? DP World is a global operator of ports and terminals, as well as a integrated logistics company that has multimodal operations throughout the world. I believe we operate 70 terminals, and 10% of all container traffic goes through one of our facilities. We are headquartered in Dubai, and at the core of our business is the idea that we will change what's possible for everyone. One of those cores is our world, our future strategy. And as part of this, we are constantly looking at resiliency around our impacts, not just to the environment, not just to climate, but how we can work with the entire chain, how we can work with the communities in countries, particularly where the economies are growing, changing, developing, and use our infrastructure to support their growth, which is also our growth. One of the ways that we work on this is recently, I believe within the last year, we've working with JP Morgan to review our port and terminal operations in the framework of a sustainable development impact disclosure. We currently have 5 of those that have been published: South Africa, Brazil, India, Senegal, and I will always forget the 5th one. But we are really interested in understanding not just what our environmental footprint is, but our social footprint, our economic footprint, and how we can use our infrastructure and our facilities to improve all aspects of that. So when I think about resiliency, I think about it in a way that is different, I think, than what most of the speakers that I've heard so far in the last day and a half have been articulating it. For me, it's less about resiliency when it comes to the impacts of climate change or climate adaptation or unusual events. And it's more about taking our assets, our infrastructure, and making economies and societies stronger. And when we take that kind of investment and we put it into the communities that support us by shipping their goods through our facilities, everybody wins. And that's what I think is at the heart of DP World's vision to change what's possible for everyone.
Can I ask you a follow-up? So,
Always.
Since I'm the chair.
Yes.
So I get to your story around sustainability. It's a quite a nice, powerful story. Do you think that ports are able to absorb shocks and to be resilient if there's an economic shock or a disruption of some sort? How does that work?
Sure. You touched on the COVID shocks. I personally felt a lot of those because my husband also works in freight operations, and the ability for this system to have that resiliency and be able to withstand those shocks and adapt quickly, I think is something that is particularly unique to what we do. It might not have felt like it to people who were trying to get a particular item, especially if you live here in the US. We're used to having things really fast. But the way that we can adapt and evolve is I think remarkable. The fact that we can get all of these products and goods to market within the speed that we can is something that others, in manufacturing, you have to retool systems, and we can take our information technology and our engineering expertise and more quickly reroute things. If you're looking at a very particular terminal, obviously expanding a terminal or increasing the throughput, that's a long-term investment, right? We need to go through the process of acquiring land, getting approvals, buying equipment, paving, finding enough workers, that kind of building of the infrastructure can take a long time. But if we are looking at just using the infrastructure that we have, I think this industry, one of the things that's kept me in it for over 20 years now is how innovative it can be, how fast it moves, how very cool everybody is and passionate about what they do. I joke that, and I apologize, this is a bad American reference, but they're like MacGyvers with duct tape and a paper clip, and they'll figure out a way to get that shipment from point A to point B on time and in full as best that they can.
Very good. Thank you. So very agile and able to respond to the shock. Great. So earlier I was talking about, so basically we talked about the basic infrastructure of rail and ports and how agile they can be and resilient. One of the major impacts we saw in the last 4 or 5 years as in the major shocks has been through food security and essentially the supply chains around food security. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and turn to my colleagues from the international financial institutions. So maybe first Max Jensen, who is the Director of Mobility Department at the European Investment Bank. And I wanted to ask you essentially, how does transport infrastructure help improve food security and reduce supply chain volatility or fragility? Yeah.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I see we are a bit less popular than the CD's discussion before, but back to the resilience again. I think maybe it's not fully understood, and I'll get back to that, the importance of the resilience. Also, maybe very quickly, European Investment Bank is not that we're just operating in Europe. Our shareholders are the 27 member states. We do most of our lending in Europe, but still a major share is done outside of Europe. So we do about 12 to 15 billion investments in transport a year, and maybe around 20% is actually outside Europe. So it's still quite a significant share. The other point we also are doing as being in Europe is that we work very closely with the European Commission in formulation of policies, strategies, financial instruments, we'll get back to later. So I think that's an important point as well. And this is where I wanted to address maybe some of the legal and regulatory framework that makes transport systems function or not. You're down to the food security, so it's really down to the weakest link in the connectivity. And that is not a national matter, regional matter really anymore, like you were mentioning in the beginning as well. It's very much about the globalization. So back to the legal and regulatory framework. So we have the Trans-European network, which is then extending into other networks across the globe, as you mentioned, which was actually established in law and in regulation all the way back in 1996 in Europe. So that defined corridors in Europe, standards need to be harmonized, interoperability, the modal shift, all the nodes and all the connections, whether in railways, ports, airports, roads, short sea shipping, etc., that needed to be in place. So that came in and defined then 9 core corridors in Europe, plus a comprehensive network that are to feed into the 9 main corridors. That was then extended to neighboring countries, in particular in 2017 to the Western Balkans. And I think also now very importantly, we're talking about resilience in 2022 to Ukraine and Moldova, some of the very important aspects. What this legal framework is trying to do is to harmonize transport modes to make them interoperable, especially the railways is very complex as well, but there are also many missing links across across Europe. What it's trying to do is to improve those links across all sectors and do that in an integrated manner. The objectives are now to complete, in fact, the core network by 2030, the comprehensive by 2040. But we're not really getting there. I think still there's still a lot of differences. Maybe you see that it's working well in Europe, but there's still many missing links. There's still national interest as well. So it's overly complex, but I do think that we can learn from some of those aspects also to see to take those across to other regions. And so what we saw in terms of disruptions also of the network was in particular with Ukraine, that basically not just impacted Europe, but actually all the world, in particular Africa as well, with the supply chains. And what was not maybe fully understood is the vulnerability of the networks. This is what we need to look into. It's not just the interoperability and getting the networks in place. It's actually the resilience of these networks to respond to shocks, whatever these are, climate or other events. In that sense, we work closely with the European Commission as well in what was called the solidarity lanes to try to establish new links, border crossings, etc., into Ukraine and connect that to the European network. So what I wanted to say is I think it's important to have some common standards in place, a framework that we can work towards. You can see this is almost 30 years ago. It's still not in place, but that's a direction I think we need to go. And then have more tools, not just to now close the missing links and so, but also to have the resilience aspects taken into account, because then the vulnerability of the networks, it's really down to the weakest link for these to be disrupted. And that's a tool I think we need to have in place, and we need to work jointly, collectively on between the different partners and MDPs and so on to make the networks work.
Great explanation of what everything that happened in Europe and on trying to set up these corridors and where you're heading. Let me turn to Andres Pizarro, who is actually the manager of public sector clients at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, who's working, of course, in uses of policy interventions, but also financing in low and middle-income countries. Maybe, Andres, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see the role of cold storage and what else needs to be done to improve the value chains around food distribution, and to make sure that we don't have insecurity as we've seen in the last few decades. So how do you see that in terms of policies and investments in cold storage as well?
Thank you, Charles. Just quickly to introduce also AIB. AIB is the newest multilateral development bank. We are 9 years old. We have a couple of unique points. We've only financed infrastructure, and under the same roof, we do non-sovereign and sovereign financing. We have the largest share base after the World Bank with 110 member countries. And although we're Asian, our mandate allows us to finance outside of our regional members. So going back to your question, I think there are two elements to this question. One is cold storage facilities, and the other one is the road transport network and trucking system. So on the storage facilities, I think we could envisage or suggest 4 points to look at. One is planning. I mean, I think no serious infrastructure or service development can go without planning. So I think master plans that define what networks and what facilities, what hubs will link the type of food or other goods to be transported is a must. And that planning will guide not only public sector investment, but private sector investment. And that leads us to the second point. And in this subsector, this sector is the one that's most likely to be able to mobilize private sector financing because of the nature of the activities. So the second point is to put in place incentives and policies that, in this case, allow some leapfrogging with respect to developed countries, and particularly cold storage facilities that are fuel efficient. So that, because of the efficiency and the reduction of a global public good, or the increase of the global public good, because of the fuel efficiency, that may require some public investment to trigger additional attraction of private sector money. The third point I'd suggest is also a leapfrog policy that would be to incentivize private financing the private sector manufacturing these cold storage facilities. We saw in COVID what happened with countries that were not able to be self-sufficient in basic things. And so to enhance development, we should seek to try to finance or help countries, even lower middle income countries, to be able to acquire these technologies and manufacture. And the last one would be regulations that impede dumping of older technologies in developing countries from higher income countries with regulation. And then the second element is the trucking of the operators. And in lower income countries, and I've seen that in many places, there's been a move, either willing or because of lack of enforcement, that generated a deregulated sector. And and as a result of this deregulation, you got sectors that informal, where the lack of large companies or firms that can reproduce and invest in vehicles of modern vehicles, not even refrigerated vehicles, but modern vehicles. For instance, 20 years ago, you'd see in Côte d'Ivoire this system, and the only way to be able to present a more professional trucking industry were the shippers that had to create their own company. So the shipper would come, and then they would have the trucks, because they couldn't rely on the existing system. And in other countries in Latin America, the shippers forced the existing trucking companies with long-term contracts to formalize, so they could have a long-term view or long-term visibility, so that they could invest in better vehicles. So this is to say that I think the way forward in that segment is to create regulations that allow for the firms to have visibility, medium-term visibility, so they can invest in higher quality vehicles and refrigerated vehicles. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Andres. So Max, you've talked about you gave us a hint earlier that you had some financing instruments. I wanted to know. So we've talked about the infrastructure and the ports, the rail, and so on. We talked about legislation frameworks, but what about logistics? What kind of financing mechanisms can we come up with to improve logistics around these trade corridors? And is there any models where there are PPPs or private sector to attract private sector in the logistics part of these corridors?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, logistics part of all of the infrastructure. And maybe before we're talking about financial instruments and innovative financial instruments, I think it's very important to go back to what we discussed before, and what Andres also just mentioned now about regulation, because to create innovative or financial instruments, basically what you're doing is you're de-risking the investments, right? Mm-hmm. In order to de-risk investments, you need to have certainty, and therefore you have to have regulations. If the regulations are changing every 2 weeks, which we have seen over the past 2 weeks, right, in many areas, then it's very difficult to get private sector in, because they are not willing to take the risk. Mm-hmm. They're not willing to invest. We're talking decarbonization, introduce new technologies. They're typically more expensive, but we are putting thresholds in many areas for decarbonization, for instance, on alternative fuels, other aspects that's more expensive, but nobody's willing, if they see that there's a risk or chance that the regulations are going to change over the next year, to make off-take agreements for the next 10 or 15 years on some of those aspects. So I think this is why it's really important, no matter whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, that you have this legal and regulatory framework in place and you stick to it. So for instance, the Trans-European network that includes all the logistics, and so you know what is to be done. Now this year in 2025, in fact, the European Commission is now putting into the legislation as well that certain projects must be completed, because before there's just been an incentive and they've been subsidized and so on, and member states have then come up with proposals to do some of the projects, but they're not doing all of them, because what is interesting in one country is not necessarily interesting in a neighboring country, and then the logistics chain doesn't work. So actually now this is coming into legislation that certain projects must be done, and then there will be financial calls where we'll have blending, other instruments coming in, so there will be money available. We will, at the European Investment Bank, look through the bankability of these projects and see what kind of instruments, how to get the private sector engaged as well. Again, back to resilience and indicators. So some things of the decarbonization, I think, sorry, you mentioned as well, the vulnerability of the social inclusion as well is really important, because with the concept of just transition, just resilience is basically saying, yes, we are moving ahead in a more advanced world, and that's benefiting large share of the population, but we're also leaving many behind in this. So you also need to have those funds, because those are the vulnerable communities, etc. And so it's called transport poverty. It also needs to be addressed. And there is some cross subsidies being made as well. So, for instance, in Europe now there's a proposal to have the emission trading scheme, the second ones coming in, where you're then levying the fuel consumption in buildings, in road transport, etc., and creating a social climate fund that then is basically to address those vulnerable communities. And so, but that's back to resilience and saying, in order to make that bankable, you need some clear indicators and harmonization saying what is social inclusiveness, what is resilience. And that's where I think we need to work together and have these indicators, because once you have something firm like that, then these can be audited. You can actually start issuing bonds, green bonds already issued, but also be discussing about sustainability awareness bonds, but these are all being audited. So you need to know what the money flows are exactly to make this work. And in that way, you can raise money for the infrastructure, for the logistics you need to do. But it's back down to regulation. Again, I'm saying uncertainty. Otherwise, you don't get the investments done.
So let me deviate from the script a bit. So so I think that, so great that you're here, Max, because I always think that the EU is so great at setting up, legislation, legislative framework, regulatory systems that, as you said, bring certainty to investors and essentially then there's a role to de-risk. But outside of Europe, we don't have that luxury of this coordination. And one maybe a question for Andres, and maybe you want to pick up that question, is essentially, how do we do capacity building and build institutions that collaborate with each other along corridors where we don't have, let's say, an economic union like the EU, and other corridors we don't have that? So how do you see, what is the role of IFIs, and how do we build this coordination mechanism, regulatory mechanisms across boundaries, across countries, to be able to make sure that there's certainty for investors and so on? Maybe you wanted to answer that. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Andres.
Hello. I think before talking about across countries, I think one of the issues and the basic building block for logistics, again, is the trucking, the trucking system. And that requires regulation. In low-income countries, what's happened is a kind of informality that's taken place. So as Max said, without the regulations that allow for let's say, for these companies to have, well, in some countries, they're not even companies. And so to become companies so that they can reproduce themselves, so they can at least have enough revenues so that they can take into account the depreciation of vehicles and then invest further, then you need a framework, a regulatory framework that's serious, that has minimum standards. And that doesn't require a lot of investments. And banks like the World Bank, like us, we can do capacity building with grants based on a regular. But I think that it's a more of a country initiative than us. What we can do, and in this subject of cold storage and cold chains, what we've done is investments. We've mobilized investment for facilities, cold storage facilities. We've done in a couple of hubs in China around an airport and in an inland port that have been very, very interesting. Because we do both sovereign and non-sovereign. In one case, it's been sovereign financing, another non-sovereign finance to an SOE, for example. And that limited investment, even the sovereign one, helped to create an environment to attract private sector, which is it's a sector where they can easily finance. And we've done something very interesting as well. We do intermediary financing. We finance a fund that is investing equity in a very innovative company that's manufacturing cold storage facilities based on innovative. I don't understand very much the technology, but it has to do with gas, doing something with the gas, but it's innovative technology in a pilot in Korea that can be expanded. So I think.
So thank you for that. Let me
Okay.
let you come back to you in a minute. I wanted to, maybe the maritime sector has some answers to these questions. So let me introduce Jennifer Carson, who's the Senior Vice President of Boundary Stone Partners and Executive Director of Sustainable Maritime Coalition. I like the coalition part. So Jennifer, so you've heard a bit what we've been talking about, resilience of supply chains and how do we make them more efficient. So one question I have for you is what do you see the role of technology? I think Andres introduced the digitization technology. Where do you see the role of that? And I do have a question about how do we the maritime sector is a better coordinated sector across the world, I would say. So how do you see coordination of let's say legislative framework or policies to make supply chains more resilient and efficient? So those are two questions. Sorry
No,
for
that's
that,
great.
but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maritime sector is in an interesting position right now because there are pending regulations that are actually going to be put pen to paper this year through the International Maritime Organization. So the IMO, for those of you not familiar, I'm sure most of you are, has set some pretty aggressive targets for the maritime sector with a full decarbonization by 2050. This happened just a couple of years ago, and the proceedings over the last few years have been contemplating a couple of different things. One is, how do you calculate emissions, even in the maritime sector, when it has not really been as sort of data intensive, even on ships or at ports? How do you define the pathways to get to decarbonization? What's the definition of a decarbonized or net zero fuel? There are a number of different fuel pathways that are being contemplated across the maritime sector, everything from green methanol, green ammonia, biofuels, sort of you name it. But even having the standards, which has been kind of talked about a lot, a standard by which you can even measure those fuels is still being developed both right now at the IMO, and it's far behind, I would say, even sectors like aviation that has better kind of like calculated standards for what the kind of emissions profile of different fuels are. And it's not just about the fuels. If the maritime sector is going to meet the both interim and long-term targets, it's going to require a number of different technological breakthroughs in order to kind of get towards that international regulatory framework. So whether that's new engines, like engines are now just being qualified, like really qualified well for using methanol. Ammonia is sort of coming up behind it, but even pathways like ethanol or biofuels aren't necessarily well understood for utilization in these, big, usually heavy fuel oil using engines. But there are a number of different kind of technologies that are being looked at. How do you optimize shipping routes to decrease energy usage, both because of the emissions profile, but also these fuels are more expensive. So if shipping costs aren't going to go completely through the roof, you're going to need more efficient routes. But because of even the profiles of some of these fuels, it's also going to require new things like new bunkering at ports. And how do you invest in kind of bunkering infrastructure that's going to be necessary for the maritime sector to meet these international regulations? And so it's going to take a mix of both, how do you quantify and measure the outcomes of the kind of shipping industry? Who is going to make the investments? Who's going to have a willingness to pay, especially from a first mover perspective? You've seen companies like Maersk and others make some pretty big commitments to, green methanol ships, with others coming up behind it. But now the challenge is you have to find the fuels, you have to quantify the fuels, you have to build out the fueling infrastructure, you have to figure out what's going to happen now with heavy fuel oil if you're not using it in the shipping space, and how do you adopt new technologies at ports and on board ships in order to meet the pretty aggressive international targets. We talked about financing mechanisms. This is also something that the IMO is contemplating. The IMO is trying to figure out what are the market-based measures that can be used to compensate, whether it's lower income country ports that are going to have to invest in this new fueling infrastructure, or smaller fleets that are going to have to meet these new regulations, or even compensating some of the big fuel consumers because of the higher cost of fuel right now, until better subsidization or technological breakthroughs catch up. And it's, while the maritime sector is incredibly resilient, 80% of our cargo moves on ships. All of these, new regulatory pathways are going to take both technological breakthroughs and also just adoption of new technologies in what has been traditionally a more risk-averse sector. So it's literally the drafting of the standards are coming out in this spring with potential adoption next fall by the IMO through member states. And I think that's going to be a really important signal and catalyst for creating sort of a global investment into the technologies that will meet those international regulations. And this is where maritime is really interesting because it's sort of irrespective of individual countries saying, I don't want to opt in. You can't if the global shipping industry is global, because either way you're going to have to pay in some way, shape, or form. But technologies are really going to be the critical catalyst to ensuring resiliency, because say we don't invest in those technologies, the international regulatory frameworks are still there. Shipping companies have to pay more in fines or levies by not meeting the IMO standards. Those fines or levies will be passed on basically to consumers tied to inflation through container rates, because the shipping companies aren't necessarily just going to pay. Those costs get borne on by consumers. So it's a delicate balance of investment in technology without the certainty of exactly what the technological pathway is, setting a regulatory framework, setting up market mechanisms, really thinking critically about kind of who bears the costs and what are going to be the frameworks by which you get there in the maritime sector.
Great, thanks. You want to intervene on that? Go ahead.
Actually, yes. There were a few thoughts that I had that from listening to my fellow panelists speak, not just Jennifer, but I'd like to offer a different perspective that's outside of regulation. I've been doing this a very long time, so I have a memory and a passion for this particular space. And most of what has come now into regulation came out of what the industry has been doing, and not just the maritime industry, but the logistics industry as a whole. Containerization was created by a man named Malcolm McLean. And if you don't know anything about the history of containerization, there's a wonderful book called The Box that will teach you all kinds of very nerdy things about this industry. And many of the emission factors that we currently use to calculate the carbon profile came out of an initiative that was started 20 years ago now. Don't do math, please. Where the container industry said, well, we don't really like that you all are talking about regulating us without understanding what we're doing. So they created the Clean Cargo Working Group, which now sits as part of the Smart Freight Center. And they created the methodology to calculate their emissions. Having worked at both the IMO and Maersk, and having been part of Regulation 22A requiring the flag or the ships to report to their flag states, their carbon emissions, that methodology is not part of that calculation. I can tell you why, but I won't tell you why. The technologies that are coming out around methanol, that was Maersk innovating. We are, I think, misunderstood quite a bit around what it is that we can do as an industry, and that we have to have regulation to make us do it. I was in Dubai 2 weeks ago and had the opportunity to talk with the leadership for all of DP World about sustainability and where we should go. And we did ask the question, well, what do you think with all of this change that's happening globally, with the different discussions that are happening around climate, around sustainability, what does that mean for us? And the answer that we received was, it doesn't change the facts. DP World has been investing. We've been investing in countries that are not have no regulation, in electric equipment, in alternative fuels. We have a objective through the Science-Based Targets Initiative to be carbon neutral by 2050, 42% reduction in scope 1 and scope 2 by 2030. That requires huge investment. And we have a large trucking fleet in Africa. That's not regulated. we will be making these investments because for us, there's a business opportunity behind it. And that's the perspective that I want to leave you with. If I don't say another word up here, is just that regulation is a tool in the box. And I think that we also need to remember when we're talking about the costs, and Jennifer, you started to mention it, this shows up in what you and I pay. And remember, it is not a few dollars on a pair of Nikes. High value goods are not most of what's going in those containers. This is changing the lives of people in economies where those few dollars may be the majority of what they make in that week and what they support their families with. So when we're talking about these tools, excuse me, these tools in the box, just think about it from that holistic standpoint and put yourself in the place of the consumer, because what you and I do is what's driving all of this.
Very good, thank you, Sarah. So definitely different views around the role of regulation, whether it leads or whether it should coordinate, let's say, what's already happening in the business. I wanted to hear from Francois. I think Francois, if you want to respond to that. I also had a question about what innovations you see in the railway sector, and how do you future-proof railway investments? If you allow me that question,
I would try to to respond to both. But first of all, I would just like to do a point about railway, which is quite different from the other modes. We are already a mode that is really emitting a very low carbon. If you take, for instance, a modern, let's say, railway system, the European one, the whole European system is basically around 17% of modal share, freight actually, and then 0.5% of emissions of the transport sector, meaning that we are already carbon neutral. And I do think that for us, the challenge to be carbon neutral by 2040, well, it's more or less done in terms of technology. So that means that we are a little bit in a different position, where the question is not really how to decarbonize rail, because mainly decarbonize, but how to have more trains, to have more freight on trains, and how to make it easy for the economy to have this kind of change of paradigm. And that's where the questions begins, because one of the key questions for rail is that we have very low externalities, very low noise, very low emission, very low pollution, and we are paying most of our externalities, and we are confronted with other sectors, unfortunately, for instance, the trucking industry, that is not paying its externality. So one of the questions for us is really how to have more train, and also how to have tools that will make carbon finance at the pace to really finance those investments. Well, that is true in a way for Europe, but in Europe there are mechanisms, but it's absolutely true for developing countries. Let me take an example. We had the prize yesterday for Senegal. So Senegal, they have a wonderful BRT, but they have also a TR, well, a train that they are doing for the suburbs of Dakar, which is a success, but they are really struggling to finance it because they don't have any subsidies, any right financing. And there is also something that they cannot finance, and they are struggling for finding financing. That's a rail link between the port of Dakar and the hinterland of Senegal. That will be, I think, something really amazing for the port itself, because you will be able to have more throughput, and also for the population, because you need to know that they have a lot of trucks that are basically destroying the surrounding of the harbor, and they have to do the road between the harbor and the north of the country every 4 years. So the question that what we are advocating is to be able to have, through financial institutions, the support for this additional investment, and to back it through the carbon avoidance. And if we are speaking about innovation, so basically for us, the innovation is more how do we better link with trucks, basically with ports, or we are able to have border crossing procedures that are harmonized, and how we can really have an holistic approach for the whole logistics chain. So that's something we are working in UIC. Well, not entering into the detail, but we have some development about wagon management, about how to improve border crossing, how to improve the way we are doing the planning for the train pass at the European level, and to be sure that we have harmonized tool, and in particular, harmonized tool with the trucking industry to be sure that the transport of containers, because everything is on containers basically, will be really smoothless between the rail network and the road network.
Okay, thank you so much. I have one quick follow-up for Jennifer, and then I'll open up the floor for questions if anyone has questions. Jennifer, actually you steered the conversation a lot towards decarbonization in the last 15, 20 minutes that we've talked about. Do you see, so when we initially started to talk about on this panel was essentially supply chain disruptions and making sure that that trade corridors are resilient. Do you see a trade-off between going too fast on decarbonization versus being able to meet the basic services with all the shocks that are happening? Do you think that you can decarbonize really quickly and still be resilient? That's sort of my question.
That's a tricky question. And I do acknowledge the maritime sector is actually been leading in this space, and it's been surprising even US regulators with their commitments to sustainability, irrespective of any sort of goals, because they recognize that it's a global imperative. But are you going too fast? It's a question. The speed at which can you build out the refineries for fuels that are going to be working in these ships? What's the timing and the investment that's going to be needed to ensure that each one of the ports has availability of compliant fuel is still something that's being contemplated. 2050 is a really aggressive target for a massive sector. And so I think it's going to require iterative policy changes, most likely, before that target. Although I'd be curious for Sarah's perspective here, but it is a really aggressive timeline. And but at the same time, the maritime sector, when they have faced supply chain disruptions or shocks or changes, take even something as small or big as the Francis Scott Key Bridge, collapsing in the Port of Baltimore. There was an automatic rerouting of all the freight that had gone there in a pretty seamless way that still allowed for delivery. So, I think the question is going to be, what is the overall, I think there are estimates that to meet the IMO regulations would cost about $1 trillion in investment into infrastructure. How fast does that infrastructure get built out? How do you allow for, maybe smaller fleet vessels to comply on a longer basis, ones that haven't had the capital to make the investments into dual or tri-fuel ships? And so I think we're going to have to see. I mean, I still think 2050 is really, really aggressive. And to Sarah's point too, you have to balance, these ships are bringing goods to people worldwide. So what you don't want to do is end up disrupting people's lives or their food supply chains for goals and targets. So I wish I had a more perfect answer than that, other than we're going to have to wait to see what the regulatory framework looks like, what the investment framework looks like, and how the industry continues to adapt. Because to Sarah's point, they already have been thinking about this before the IMO finalized any sort of regulations.
And if I may add to that, I don't stay up at night worrying about how the industry will meet its decarbonization goals. That doesn't worry me. I think we can figure that out. What worries me is the disruption of trade. It worries me that terminals or ships or airplanes, for that matter, are stuck, and that what we saw with COVID, I think woke people up to what our industry does. And it would be such a blow to the world if sustainability were to cause that kind of disruption, even if it was a fraction of that. I think it would lose us a lot of goodwill politically. I think it would cause a regression of our sustainability goals globally that we don't want to see.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a good summary for the session. Are there any burning questions for these wonderful panelists? Marc, go ahead. Yeah, there's a mic over there. Yeah.
So, Marc Juel, once World Bank, always World Bank. That would be a question That's a real question for both Jennifer and Sarah, I guess. Speaking of port emissions, in the fall of 2023, both DP World and APM terminals together released a study on emissions in port, and in the wake of that, launched an initiative called ZEPA, Zero Emission Ports Alliance. Could you give us a quick update on where do we stand on this? Thanks.
Yeah. ZEPA is an initiative that's trying to create the tipping point for manufacturers to offer up electric equipment for our terminals at a lower cost, or at least parity to diesel equipment. So we are currently still working on that. You'd be surprised at how few of the OEMs were really excited about it. But we will, I think at this point, there are 20 members. Most of the marine terminal operators around the world have joined, and we are continuing to push that. In the meantime, I hope you all know that both DP World and APMT have continued to deploy this equipment very successfully, at least in our case.
I think the question was also for you. You don't have anything to add, Jennifer? You're all right to responded. Very good. Is there? Are we having any questions from people online? Yes.
So I'm here to pose that. Someone asked, what are the lessons in mobilizing private sector engagement in smaller European states for integration into the larger logistics and supply chain that can be useful, for example, to link Pacific Islands to Greater Asia? Anyone can pick up the question.
What are the? So Max, what?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Maybe it comes back to your idea of the framework, right? That it needs to be a coordinated approach, or that's what essentially was my question earlier. Europe is fantastic at setting up regulations that actually lowers the risk of investment. Not easy to replicate. And in the Middle Corridor, for instance, we've been working. There's 14 railway companies across this corridor. So how do you, how in the Pacific? I'm assuming it's essentially multimodal. It's a lot of maritime. So how do you get countries that don't necessarily have an economic union to work across a corridor? And that's a bit the question. Yeah.
For the audience online, no, indeed. But I think first of all, I'm not necessarily just advocating for regulation. It's not to misunderstand, but I think sometimes it's probably need to drive some aspects of it, otherwise you're not achieving the goals that have been set. The ideas of the European example is not necessarily say, yes, this is how it works, this is how it should work everywhere, because that's certainly not the case. Or you have to see how you customize this and how you adjust this right to the market needs. But I do think, like you also said, and certainly also for the railways, that there need to be different regions coming together in some sort of unions. And so, because otherwise you're never going to have any kind of engagement. Everybody will kind of take care of their own interest, and so I don't know if between the MDBs or the bilaterals, and so if there is a possibility, right, to more collectively come together and say, both you pool funds as well available, because at the moment it's you can go probably to 100 different trust funds and things, and all of them have different objectives, and so if there could be some common goals set, the MDBs that all take a very large share of investments across the globe also come closer together, and we are having many working groups and discussions on how to do that. So we jointly can come up with some sort of policy framework that could facilitate and bring down costs and have the investments done. I think these are some of the aspects maybe to consider.
I see Francois wanted to respond, and then we'll pass.
And perhaps rapidly, there is always a capacity of any sectors to have some kind of self-organization. And if I take another example, which is the question to have a railway network at the African level, there are studies from the African Union, and we are working with them in order to set up the framework. So there is a study ongoing, and I do think that's a role of the institutional financing institution that will be to finance studies and capacity building in order that this kind of coordination can actually be effective. Let's take an example for rail. For rail, there is a very touchy issue, which is what do you do with wagons at an international level? Because the wagons, they are everywhere. That's the case in Europe, that is the case in the Middle East, for instance. You have a French wagon that is in Germany or in Spain or whatever. And how do you manage the fact that you need to maintain this vegan? And for that, there is no regulation. That's a self-organization of the sector to be sure that the vegan is maintained. We don't enter into the detail, but there is always the capacity of the sector to have common rules. Well, that's what the maritime sector also does, to be sure that we can organize ourselves.
Very good. Andres, you have the last
I just
word.
want to go back onto this debate on regulation. I mean, regulation is a general word, but there are rules and standards that affect different sectors and subsectors. The point I was trying to make is that if DP World needs to put trucks on the road in a country, it means that the trucking industry in that country is inefficient, have bad quality, is generating externalities, and therefore is not reliable for what we were discussing, which is food security, reducing losses, etc. If each country has to rely on DP World, Merck's, whatever, to set up a viable trucking company in the country, is that it's not working. And the way to do is to regulate the standards so that these systems can create companies that are able to reinvest, that are not in many countries it's an owner driver that has a very low quality vehicle, and therefore will never be able to generate enough revenue to have decent refrigerated trucks. So there's a question of regulation there that's necessary. I've seen it in all but one developing country abroad.
Very good. I think we are out of time. So thank you very much for a lively conversation. Thank you to all the panelists for this very interesting event. Yep.